Hi, welcome. Welcome to this Education Connection. I'm Mark Luttrell. I'm board president for Bellevue Schools Foundation. First off, I want to thank Newport Knives for preparing the lunch for us today. They do an awesome job. So, thank you for joining us for this Candidate Forum for Bellevue PTSA Council and also for partnering with us to bring you this informative event. We've compiled a number of questions for each candidate with input from foundation, district staff, PTSA council membership, and from questions that you submitted with your registrations. So with the short time we have, we'll get through as many questions as we can. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond to each question. And if possible, we'll leave 10 minutes at the end for a meet and greet if you have further questions. So please join us in welcoming Erin Jones and Chris Reykdal, and we'll let them each introduce themselves. After this brief announcement from our PTSA.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jess Garcia, and we're excited on behalf of all the PTAs, all 30 PTAs in Bellevue, to have you here and our collaboration with the Schools Foundation. I get to do the spiel of the legalese, so bear with me. Please note that the PTAs as are 501c3 nonprofit organizations. We cannot legally participate in any campaign activities. We can only provide unbiased, nonpartisan, equal opportunity educational opportunities. This means you are not allowed to bring or distribute any campaign information or paraphernalia of any kind at this event or any school property by law. No one from any campaign and no audience member can bring or distribute any campaign information or paraphernalia of any kind at this event or on school property. And it cannot be distributed. Thank you again for keeping us in compliance with our 501c3 campaign and advocacy laws by respecting this request. Thank you again for your attendance.
Why don't you go ahead and go first, Erin?
Okay, so do we have 2 minutes for introduction?
Just a few. No.
We're used to being timed. I know, exactly. We could go on for hours.
3.
Okay.
How about 3?
Okay, good. So my name is Erin Jones, and I am so honored to be here. I've actually spent a lot of time in this building. I was the AVID district director. So if any of you are familiar with the AVID program, I was the AVID director in Federal Way and in Tacoma, and we had meetings here. So I've been in this space quite a few times. I have a really unique personal story. I was orphaned at birth because my father was black, my mother was white, and adopted at 6 months old by a white couple who were both teachers from northern Minnesota. They never met black people before. They just made a choice to adopt black babies because they knew there were so many of us in foster care that were not being adopted out. And so I became one of the few kids that were adopted. In Minnesota today, about 80% of black children, if they have any black in them, don't get adopted. And I was one of the lucky few, and they adopted me, and then they adopted my little brother, and we doubled the black population in our county. And then my parents made a conscious choice to raise us in a country where race wouldn't be a factor. So I was raised at the American School of The Hague in the Netherlands, where my parents were teachers for 32 years. I did K-12 there. And what that meant for me is I was surrounded by really powerful political figures, international politicians, international lawyers, international business people. And I had the benefit of a really phenomenal private school education for free because my dad was a teacher there. And I thought every kid had that experience until I came to the United States at 18 and went to college in Philadelphia at Bryn Mawr and realized really quickly, especially kids who look like me, were not getting that great education. You know, I came to the United States speaking 4 languages, having played 3 instruments, triple varsity athlete, and I thought that was normal, that kids had exposure. And in Philadelphia, where I went to school, if you were black, you went to schools that had no textbooks, and teachers often who didn't have their credentials, and if you were white, you had computer labs, and I saw this incredible disparity. And really, by the time I was 20, I made a conscious choice. I called home to my parents and said, I'm not coming back. I'm going to do the very thing I promised my whole life I wouldn't do. I'm going to become a teacher just like you. And I made a conscious choice then at 20. I'm going to make sure that zip code and race and home language are not the greatest predictors of a student's success. And I didn't have any idea that that would lead me to this, but knew that I wanted to make a difference in whatever way I could. So I was a classroom teacher. I worked at OSPI as a director and then assistant superintendent, and then spent the last 4+ years as a school district administrator, raised 3 kids through public schools in Washington State. And my husband, actually, when I won the Milk and Educator of the Year award, we used my $25,000 check to put my husband through graduate school to become our son's first black teacher. So my oldest son had his dad as a teacher his senior year for English. And we really believe in the power of role modeling. We absolutely believe that kids can't imagine what they've never seen. And so part of my running is to be a model for our young students of color that teaching is an incredible career. And so that's me, Erin Jones.
Thank you, Erin. And Chris?
Thank you for having us here today. We're on our 731st forum of this campaign season. We've actually had a lot. It's been pretty remarkable, and we're sort of wrapping it up now. But thank you so much for having us here today. My name is Chris Reykdal, another candidate for superintendent of schools for the state of Washington. My journey is very different than Erin's. We both bring this very incredible passion and a lens from which we've seen the world. And for me, I was born and raised north of here in Snohomish, a little small town of great antiques. And unfortunately, through a lot of poverty. Youngest of 8, my oldest 6 siblings spent a couple years in the foster care system just prior to my birth. My parents were alcoholics, to be candid with you, and the state intervened and separated that family to create stability for my siblings, and then, asked what we always ask of parents in that environment: get clean and sober, reunite the family, and then here's some steps to move forward. And my parents did that, and I'm very, very grateful for that. They are both deceased since then. But I grew up in this incredible family of love and support, despite by then being very, very poor. And so public assistance sort of saved us, and then it was really my public school experience that I was able to break that cycle and do something very different. I was first in my family to go to college, went to Washington State University. I became a teacher, school board member. I've had this incredible opportunity to serve in higher education for the last 14 years as an executive in our 2-year community and technical college system, and a legislator. In that process, my wife and I, sight unseen, went to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where we got graduate degrees. Mine is in public administration with a focus on budget and finance and performance management, which is kind of boring for a lot of people, except it brought me to the place that I dreamt of being as a young person. I wanted to influence education in a very significant way to create opportunities that I had. You're now living in a state with between 400,000 and 500,000 kids who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, or who are in even more extreme poverty. The data is relentless. It is clear. It is unquestionable that poverty is the single biggest predictor of the school experience that kids will have, particularly in this state, because we rely so heavily on local levies. So communities with great property wealth have more resource than communities of low property wealth, and it is fundamentally at the crux of the court case. So here this position comes along in OSPI to bring an education background, a finance background, a policy background, and a lens of poverty through it. And this is the passion of my life. It's a remarkable moment in our state where we get to rewrite our accountability plan now that the federal government's giving us a little relief. And I appreciate being here and look forward to the conversation.
Okay, I did it.
Thank you, Erin. All right, thank you both very much. And just to follow up, I'd like to ask each of you, and we'll start with Chris this time, what do you see as the role of superintendent of public instruction, and what is your vision for the office, especially in how it interacts with the legislature regarding education issues?
This is a fantastic question. I really appreciate it because so many of us want an office like the superintendent or the lieutenant governor or the lands commissioner to be something so much bigger than the Constitution actually allows it to be. So it's not always the sexiest thing in the world, but it is absolutely the constitutional office established to supervise all manner of public schools. It is not local control. It should not create programs, if you will. No students are enrolled there. Your job is an hourglass. That's my analogy. The legislature sprinkles in policy and budget, and it goes through this narrowing of the hourglass, and then it goes out to the districts. And that's the role of the superintendent. You are the fiduciary responsibility of all that resource. And then you flip that thing over, and what comes back from the districts through OSPI is performance and data and analysis and accountability that should be turned into actionable research so that you can go back to the legislature and say, this is what's working, this is what's not working, and here's the impact of your contemplations, policymakers, on 295 different districts. And here's the impact on communities of color, and here's the impact of communities of poverty. Here's what happens when you cut or when you add. It's an enormous opportunity for an executive to help move a system and to be a voice for a system, but not to tell local districts exactly what to do. We are a local control state where your locally elected school board should have all control over program and deployment. Our job is to really create that accountability and that support for districts and support policymakers. That's my background. I think that's what's so critical about the role. There is a new opportunity with the federal government going from No Child Left Behind to Every Student Succeeds Act to rewrite our accountability plan to give us more flexibility to empower districts in a different way. That'll be a new part of the work, but certainly not totally unusual from where we've been in the recent past.
So when I think about the work, I did sit on cabinet under Randy Dorn, and so I had the opportunity to think about both the constitutional obligation, but also what I saw in 4 years on staff at OSPI, and then now in the last 4+ years, having sat at a school district and seen the interaction or lack thereof of interaction with OSPI. And so as I imagine the work, we are responsible for all supervision of public education. But one of the things I believe that's really been lacking in the last at least 8 years is a really clear vision or strategic plan for education in the state of Washington. So what does a high-quality education look like? That's not just standards, and it's not just getting kids to have 24 credits to get a diploma. We have got to clearly articulate what is the role of public education. What would we consider quality public education, elementary, middle, high school, transitioning to post-secondary? And so I believe that one of the most powerful ways that we can engage with the legislature is really having a clear vision at the state of how does the K-12 system work. And if we have a clear vision, then that helps us articulate for the legislature, here are some of the gaps, though, and here's where we need your support. Here are some of the ways that we need funding. Here are some mandates they've given us that don't make sense now that we think about the trajectory of students. And so I talk about the OSPI in 3 ways: vision, voices, and visibility. We need to have a clear vision, but I believe we need new voices at the table to define what does great education look like. Because one of the things I believe is there have been many voices that have not been allowed at the table, and so we have the same people who have defined great public education. We need new voices at the table to create this blueprint for great education, and then we need to be visible across the state, seeing what are those best practices that are happening in different spaces in our state, telling those stories so that other districts can learn from those opportunities.
Great, thank you very much. Now, I'm sure that you have heard about the lawsuit that Superintendent Randy Dorn filed against some of the 7 wealthiest districts, including Bellevue, charging that these districts are illegally using levy dollars to pay for basic education, and that it's not only unconstitutional but unequal. Would you pursue that lawsuit as superintendent of public instruction? And if not, how would you propose to address the issues of basic education funding as so ordered in the McCleary case? And we'll start with you, Erin.
Okay. So first of all, I wouldn't have filed suit. I feel like it was irresponsible to file suit against, we already know that school districts are using levy dollars to pay for teacher salaries because the state hasn't fully funded teacher compensation. So McCleary already determined this. So to file a suit, first of all, is duplicitous. So it's asking school districts to do something that we already know the answer to this. I happen to work in Tacoma, but I also worked in Spokane. And so for me, this is really personal. And I've spoken to both superintendents and staff from both school districts, and I feel like it's a punishment of people who have no voice. They don't get to decide. And so I found it really irresponsible of Randy to do this. I also wish that if he was going to do this, he would have done it at a point that he could walk it through himself as the leader. So I think it's really interesting that now he's walking away right in the middle of the court case. I don't think either one of us is going to continue the suit, so I'm going to take my name off of it. because I don't believe it's a good way. McCleary has already made the case clear. The Supreme Court has already made the case clear. The school districts know where they're at, and they're using the resources they have. And the levy dollars are what's available to them right now. The legislature has already been clearly told, you're in contempt. You need to finish this off by the end of the session. So I think the message has already been sent loud and clear. And so for me, to ask districts to spend money to now fight this case in a time when they already have a lack of resources, I think is really irresponsible. And I wish he hadn't done this. And because it's the largest districts now, if they were to be found illegal, which if the case runs to its course, they will be. Now they're going to lose thousands of teachers, and I find that incredibly irresponsible and harmful to children.
So I never would have filed the lawsuit. It is not appropriate for the state superintendent, whose constitutional duty is to supervise all manner of public schools. You do that through 295 sub-agent organizations. So effectively, the lawsuit is saying, as superintendent, I'm suing the people I've asked to deploy public education in the state of Washington. I don't think it's appropriate. I don't think tax dollars should be spent at the state level nor at the local school district level to engage in the lawsuit. What McCleary fundamentally said, without question, is you cannot continue to rely on local levies to pay for basic education. That is the obligation of the state in order to create an equal opportunity across districts. The McCleary lawsuit never said we have to get rid of local levies. Never. Not a part of the lawsuit whatsoever, not a part of the determination by the court. It said basic expenditures have to come from the state so that levies are liberated to pay for things in addition to basic ed. The biggest risk in the lawsuit is that it would win. That somehow the court would say, yep, you can no longer use local levies for basic ed or maybe for other things, and the state would come up short of fully funding McCleary, and you would be left with a period of time in which the state's not fully funding basic ed, and levies would not be able to be used. And I can't imagine telling a community who has voted to tax itself, we do not want you to support your own children. It's crazy making. I have said, and not without controversy from Mr. Rob McKenna, former candidate for governor, that there are folks behind that lawsuit, though, that are going to seek to pursue it beyond Randy. So if one of us takes our name off it and no longer pursues the suit from the standpoint of the superintendent, others will come in. And we have to figure out if they are sincere about a different legal framework or if their real goal is to ultimately just get rid of or lower levies or, quite frankly, to get rid of local collective bargaining completely. I think the motivations are a lot out there, and they're complicated, and they're not totally insincere. But this story is not over yet until we figure out who the money is behind that lawsuit, should we take our names off it, and we both will. Stunned silence.
Yeah. Breathe. We're thinking.
So, we have the new mandates and the new changes in the ESSA, and we are wondering how you would approach that whole process and all of the changes involved.
Great question. Now that we're transitioning from No Child Left Behind, a more than 20-year-old law administered by two White House administrations, to increasingly get more into sort of the business of local districts, we moved to the Every Student Succeeds Act, led in many, many parts by Senator Murray and others. The opportunity here is that we get to walk away from very simplified definitions of accountability. If your only definition of accountability is a standardized test, and you're measuring both students by it, and some folks would like to measure teachers by it, but at a minimum measuring districts by it, you do something that's very, very amazing in the social sciences. You simply are putting a letter grade on poverty, because the correlation between student achievement in school districts based on standardized tests absolutely aligns with income in a community. So you're essentially calling low-income communities failing schools and very wealthy income communities in some cases, in many cases, achieving schools. I was a school board member where we had to label two of our schools failing, and they were not. They were poverty schools that had more growth needs than other districts or other schools, and they were doing a remarkable job at growing. So in the transition, what we get to do is write an accountability plan that goes beyond tests, that can look at student discipline, can look at disparate impacts on students of color, can look at disparate impacts on our students with special needs, those with IEPs. We can disaggregate the data and go into further detail. We can get into school climate. We can finally ask parents and families and community members their perception of schools and build that into the accountability plan. So it's a lot of work. It needs to be slowed down because I think it's going a little fast, and I think there are a lot of voices not at the table. But it's time to do this right instead of doing it quickly, because as we saw with No Child Left Behind, no one imagined it would be in place for 20 years, way beyond its shelf life. So we have to imagine the Congress doesn't have its act together for the next 20 years and write a plan that really makes sense for our state today.
So, we've been traveling the state, and one of the things I've heard in almost every space that I'm in, and spaces around special education, communities of color, anyone who's been at the table for these conversations, because part of the requirement is you have to get feedback from across the state. There's a difference between telling people they're invited to a process and actually putting their voices into the document. So for me, equitable access is not just announcing we have an opportunity for you to give feedback on every Student Succeeds Act. Access is really when people see their feedback in the document. And what I'm hearing from every single community that I talk to is, yeah, we've been listened to, but we don't see our voice in that document. And technically, the document is supposed to be turned in December. I'm going to say we have to back up and start over. Because what I know from doing work around equity for far too long, what happens is folks in power make a decision, and then they come to communities of color, or they come to the special needs community, and they say, what's your feedback? And it's almost like they're just looking for that checkoff. We came to you, right? And that's what's happening in this process right now. We've got to do it right the first time. We have an obligation to the people of the state of Washington to do it right the first time. And if that means we turn our document in late April, May, I want to make sure that this document represents the state of Washington, and especially those who've been marginalized, especially those who are in spaces that have been deemed failing for far too long. Because in my career here in Washington State, every school I taught in was a failing Title I school. And here's what I'll tell you. We had teachers there working so hard, and we had families working so hard. And no matter how much we grew, we continued to be called failing. And this is where we've got to get beyond that and get to how do we support, how do we walk alongside. And that's going to mean looking at different things besides test scores.
Okay, Erin, we're going to go back with you again. What is your take on Common Core and students opting out of the assessment process?
Okay, so those are two really different questions. As a classroom teacher, I feel like at heart, just for those who are not classroom teachers, I want to make sure that everyone understands the difference between Common Core and the test. Common Core is a set of standards. It's benchmarks. Then there's pedagogy, or how we instruct. There's curriculum, which is the texts or materials we use, and then there's the test. They're not all one and the same thing. And often when we talk about Common Core, I hear in the general public this assumption that Common Core is all of those things. And it's not. The Common Core are standards. They are benchmarks. The test is something very different. And I have some feelings about the test. I believe, first of all, as a mom myself, my kids are 19, 20, and 21. I have one that tests really well, one who comes out of trauma and doesn't test well, one who's dysgraphic, doesn't test well either, unless he has a scribe. I understand the impact of one test and what it can do to young people. And so I also believe that parents, should they choose to opt out, should be allowed to. I believe we shouldn't be bullying people. Here's what I am committed to with the state test, the Smarter Balanced Assessment. We need to make sure that that test is actually measuring what we say it's measuring. And we need to make sure that the platform is not getting in the way. And here's what I mean by that. My husband is an English teacher at the high school level. His students take the Smarter Balanced English Language Arts test. And what he said is he has kids who have to manipulate through 3 screens at one time to answer a question. And if you're not good at manipulating through 3 screens at one time, then maybe the answer we're getting is not really what you know about English language arts, but it's telling me whether you're able to manipulate through 3 screens. I believe we should be holding the Smarter Balanced Consortium accountable to make sure they give us a test for which the platform actually works for us. And we should be pushing. We shouldn't just be taking a test that's given to us. I believe as the state superintendent, it's my responsibility to advocate to make sure the format of the test works. I've been told I'm done.
So Common Core, at its heart, whether you sort of like it or not or understand it or not, attempts to address a very important challenge that our country's had for a long time. Does 4th grade math in Louisiana roughly mean the same thing as 4th grade math in the state of Washington or Montana or Idaho? Does fourth grade math between two school districts in the state of Washington roughly approach it similarly or expect the same things? Does fourth grade math in two classrooms that share a wall in the same elementary school have anything to do with each other? And you can talk about that across all kinds of subjects. So the idea is a set of core standards where we can have a reasonable expectation that students are getting a consistent approach to their content. Now, what did we choose? We chose math and we chose English language arts. So for the rest of you, apparently you can be totally on different pages for the rest of your lives. So the standard itself is going to need work because even within our state, when real practitioners got to touch it, they said, wait a second, your attempt to create common is understandable. You didn't do that. And now you're also going after some things that don't necessarily make for good development in kids. So developmentally appropriate, grade appropriate standards, it will need to evolve. Think of it as a living document where we've made some progress, but we need to go further. The far bigger issue, as Erin points out, are standardized tests. I've pushed a bill the last 2 years with huge bipartisan support in the House that delinks the high-stakes nature of the test. It says we know we have to test, the feds require it, that's okay. But we're going to use it to measure state and district progress, and we're not going to hold kids back because of it. We're going to allow kids to demonstrate proficiency taking courses aligned to standards. Good old-fashioned, rigorous courses that are meaningful. Again, enormous support from that. It's very important that kids have options, and it's very important that parents are allowed to opt out because at the end of the day, parents have to totally control their kids' education. It is their right on all kinds of fronts. It doesn't mean that we can't ask students, though, to demonstrate proficiency in other ways. Courses. High stakes, high standard courses.
Thank you very much. We'll sort of stay on the topic of mandates and that sort of thing with a question about unfunded mandates. Recently, this summer, the Bellevue community pulled together to provide funding for 3- and 4-year-olds who no longer have access to preschool, in large part because of shifting mandates and not additional funding. So we're curious about how you'll handle unfunded mandates. For example, of course, access to preschool, language acquisition, and even recently a mandate was handed down to introduce financial literacy into the high school curriculum. So if those aren't funded, then how do we continue to add these requirements?
Probably the most complicated question we get all over the state, because I ask folks very sincerely to look in the mirror, and I could give you any of these. I could give you stuff in accommodation. I could give you stuff in assessment, early childhood education, hearing and vision screening, all kinds of stuff that where there was a fiscal note 20 years ago that provided money, and since then we've added billions and cut billions in the crisis. So I always ask folks, do you not like the mandate part or the unfunded part? Because every mandate had a massive constituency behind it, and when you expose these things, that constituency comes out and says, I still want my thing. We've increased funding per pupil in this state from $7,500 to $9,600 from the state in just the 6 years that I've served in the House. We've increased it by $2,000 per child. Now, we have a ways to go, but the question is, does every single thing we expect have to come with a dollar sign, or as we continue to invest more dollars, $3.5 billion, let's say, to solve McCleary, does that pick up some of the mandates? So I've asked the superintendents in the Puget Sound ESD region to come up with a comprehensive list of things and quantify it. Tell me the mandates you think are unfunded. Let's figure out which ones you think should go away because the mandate itself is wrong. It's wrong pedagogy. It's wrong where it should be. Or tell me the ones that you think are still the right things to be doing, but for which you do not have the resource. Those are very different questions. What should go away versus what should be a priority of our investment should we actually fully fund McCleary in the next couple of years? So it's a hard answer. I think our role at the superintendent's office as the supervision of the system is to help consolidate and compile that and have a meaningful voice to the legislature that says, we've done our analysis, this is what we think works and ought to be funded. Here are mandates that even if we had the resources, we would tell you is not good practice and not effective anymore. That's the role of the superintendent, to be that voice for the system and help coach the policymakers through it. And then again, once resource comes, get it to the system with accountability.
So if I had a magic wand, I would say, legislature, you cannot pass any more mandates until you fund the ones that exist right now. It's interesting because I think having watched from OSPI every year, We got a new list of mandates. I mean, in reality, Common Core state standards and the Smarter Balanced Assessment is an unfunded mandate in its own way, right? If we don't provide support for implementation, if we don't provide free training for teachers, those in themselves become unfunded mandates. You can't just send out an email to a school district and say, oh, by the way, we're adopting these new standards now. I'm sorry, I was a classroom teacher. That's not how we learn to implement well. And so there are lots of things. The more obvious is the early childhood mandate. The more obvious is language acquisition. The whole opportunity gap bill, there's money with it, but not enough money to support 295 school districts to do that work. And so there are lots of great things that we're being asked to do. I'm going to give you an example of one that I think is really powerful and could be dangerous in a way. So we have a new mandate that's part of the Opportunity Gap Bill around discipline and a push for no suspensions and expulsions. That sounds great in theory, but if we don't train teachers in how to communicate more effectively with students, here's how that translates. Those same kids that would have been expelled or suspended now sit in an in-class, in-school suspension room. And to be really honest, that's no different than being outside of the building. They're just in a building now, not learning. And so we've got to make sure that as we have these mandates, we also have training and support for educators and for the system. I would also suggest that many of those students who are being impacted by suspension and expulsion need to learn different ways to communicate with adults and with each other as well. So restorative justice, positive behavior intervention supports. And so we've got this two-pronged opportunity to support people in the system. Just providing a new mandate doesn't save children, and it doesn't promote better support. So we've really got to think about implementing these mandates in a different way.
You all are the quietest room we've ever been in, by the way. It's impressive.
It's awkward.
It's impressive.
It's awkward.
So this question is driven by a number of pieces, and just a little bit of background is we in Bellevue are a very diverse district with over 80 different languages and students who come from over 133 countries. We have the affluent, and we obviously you've heard already, we have the socioeconomically disadvantaged. How would you empower districts with this level of diversity to deal with curriculum development, support, and family engagement in vetting the approval process? Before I finish, there have been concerns by community that, as mentioned earlier, that not all voices are being heard or that they are being ignored from every race, tribe, and tongue. Okay, so that is where that is coming from. Religiously, beliefs, faith, how things are taught, what is taught. What would your take be on the vetting process for developing curriculum and the engagement of the communities in the state?
So I think, is it my turn to start? As I thought, okay, you were looking at him, so I was confused there.
Well,
Okay.
I was just kind of looking. So.
Okay. I mean, this is the work that I've done for 25 years. And, you know, I speak 4 languages. I've lived in 3 countries, traveled to 14. So for me, this is a real passion. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier. Equal access is not putting a sign on the wall and saying, if you come to our school board meeting, then you can help with the vetting process of curriculum. Equitable access, and this is how we often do things, right? It's those people who can afford to take off. Like we were talking about this earlier. This is lunchtime. There are people who can't be in this space today because they're working, right? And so that's not equal access either. I mean, this is a better spread than we've seen in any space almost. But we often do things that way. And so I think we need to model from the state. We need to model in our processes. So when I talked about vision, voices, and visibility, I'm going to model at the state level, really intentionally inviting people to the table who've never been asked to the table. And they're not going to get an email. I'm actually going to physically go to them and make a personal request. I need you at my table. I need you at my table to represent a different perspective, because I think that's really important. Here's what else I'm going to tell you. I will come to community. And that's something that I really believe. I think oftentimes folks in power, we ask everyone to come to us all the time. And when I do training and family engagement, which is one of the things that I do training on, I talk all the time about the system needs to be the foreigner at times. Because often we ask people to come in and learn our language. And that's not equitable. We need to be the foreigner in another land and just go and listen and learn another language. And that's the only way I think that we can authentically say that we've vetted. We need to go to community. So where are the community centers? Where are the churches and the synagogues and the mosques? How do we go there and allow people to vet curriculum so that everyone, I believe every young person should see themselves in the curriculum that we're teaching, the history, the literature, the geography, every young person. And so that means we need to go to each of the communities as much as possible and hear from them.
I want to bifurcate the question because there are two very different policy tracks that occur in our state. Number one is the occasional moment where the legislature grants to the superintendent's office some cause to create a statewide group or a regional group or some kind of approach where we are the ones actually seeking feedback from around the state. That usually gets coordinated through districts. We say we need a business person, we need communities of color, we need folks who represent the special ed community, we need folks who represent math. In that work, the superintendent's office does not look at all like our students. When we ask staff there to go find folks, they will have implicit bias that is enormous because the organization doesn't reflect the diversity of our students, let alone our teachers who don't reflect the diversity of our students. So at the College Board office, we went through a very rigorous process to help ourselves understand all of that bias and the fact that we were not very sincere about our hiring processes to change the diversity of our organization, and subsequently transferred it from about 12% staff of color to over 25% staff of color, significantly more reflecting our hiring area and our students in the higher ed system. I will do that work at OSPI, and it will change how we think about building teams. But the second part that I want to make clear is no students are enrolled at OSPI, and you do not want your federal government and you do not want your state office in Olympia writing curriculum. You do not want us creating the kinds of details that should be happening right in the community. So our job is to build a framework and an expectation for districts on how they do the work, and maybe even put it in the new accountability plan to say, when you build teams and when you approach curriculum, when you do textbook adoptions, what does that look like? Is it authentic parent engagement? Is community really involved? We can put that in the accountability plan that we get a lot of voice over. But sometimes, just sometimes, people have an expectation that this office is going to roll into the Bellevue School District and have a big role in what textbooks we adopt, and you do not want that to happen. And I will not let that happen. It still has to be local, community-based. We can establish the accountability framework. You decide those steps in your community with your board.
Okay. Thank you, both of you. This question is, the special education department at OSPI works largely in isolation. That separate system is largely perpetuated within many of our school districts, including 504. How do you intend to shift that culture to ensure that each student is meaningfully included in your work and in the work of our schools?
This is powerful. The word that we should all be clinging to is inclusion. So not just come in, but fully integrated classrooms where we engage students in a very different way. We do the professional development of our staff, not just our special education community staff, but our general education staff. It's about changing the entire framework and approach, which of course needs resources. I mean, my frustration with the system, and I've sort of pounded my head against this, is that we have a civil right that we provide to students in Constitution and in law, but then we give a budget to a special education department locally and we say, balance the budget. So are we shaping IEPs and 504s to accommodate a budget, or are we actually writing full plans that provide success and opportunity for kids, including full immersion, full inclusion? That question is to be answered by each district. And so part of the plan here, I think, is to, again, transform the way OSPI approaches this. It's a rather small organization, mostly in isolation because they take so much direction from the feds. But we can have a Washington state ethos about the work. Our master here is not getting reports to the federal government to say that we made all the school districts check all the right boxes. It's actually transforming special education so that inclusion happens and students achieve. That's the goal. That's the Washington state opportunity that we have here. That's going to be a lot of headbutting with the feds to ask for more flexibility. That's going to require more resources both at the federal and state level. It's going to mean transforming the special ed team at OSPI in many ways. And it's going to cause them, if the work is done right, to engage districts very, very differently, to focus on results and not focus on compliance. If you are simply an organization that forces everyone to check the boxes, you will look brilliant because all the boxes will get checked. But here we go 20, 30, 40 years later, and outcomes for students with disabilities, ID or DD, aren't significantly different in our schools. That means we're focused on compliance and not results.
So one of the things you asked is it seemed as if special education department at OSPI is isolated. And I would say, as someone who worked in the office right next door, who tried to have contact with them, but it was hard for me to even get next door. One of the things that I would say, for me, it is problematic that even the physical space is separated. So let me just give you a picture of OSPI. On the bottom floor, when you walk in the door and walk straight back, there is one room that houses all of teaching and learning. If you go upstairs to the second floor, there is ELL migrant bilingual, there's Title I, gifted or highly capable, and there's special education. They are all physically separated. And here's what I would say, both as a classroom teacher and as a school district administrator. When those things are completely separated, what happens is it becomes those SPED kids over there, those ELL kids over there, teaching and learning down here. And here's what I would say to you. SPED should be part of teaching and learning. ELL should be part of teaching and learning. These are all instruction. We need to be talking about them as if they are one thing. And when Chris talks about inclusion is when special ed teacher and general ed, or English language arts teacher, math teacher, teach together. And so those kids who have IEPs or who have 504s are actually in a general ed classroom with a special ed expert and a para and a classroom teacher. That's inclusion. We can't have those conversations if special education is physically located so far away that they're never talking to each other. So I believe one of the things we're going to have to do is talk about physically, how do we put these spaces together so when we talk about instruction, we're talking about the many different ways that we instruct students. I was an ELL certified teacher. I'm so tired of ELL being those kids over there, that teaching over there, because the reality is most of our ELL students are actually spending 80% of their time with the general ed teacher. That general ed teacher should be supported to serve those students.
Thank you. We know our time is getting short, but we definitely wanted to go a little bit more into high-quality teaching and staffing. It's such an important issue in our state right now. The foundation and indeed our district support national board certification for teachers, and we would like to know how you would propose to advocate for high-quality teaching qualifications, ongoing support and training for them, and indeed how to attract and retain quality teachers given the challenges we have right now.
So one of the reasons I'm running is because I love teaching. As a school district administrator for the last 4 years, I have taught in a classroom at least twice a week. That's what I did because I knew it was important to model that teaching is an incredibly powerful tool. And so I think as a state superintendent, I have an obligation to talk about teaching and the power of teaching. It's how we recruit young people into the system. I've talked to over 25,000 young people this year on the campaign trail. These are not kids who are voting. I don't go and give a political speech. I talk about the power of teaching and instruction. And I can't tell you how many young people get to hear me and they say, oh, I'm going to become a teacher. She's kind of cool. We've got to make teaching sound kind of cool. Right now, it's not sounding cool to kids. It doesn't pay enough, but even more than that, as a culture, as an American culture, we don't talk about teaching as if it's a great career. I come from a country where teachers and doctors and lawyers are all like gods in our community. When I got to the United States and people said, oh, teachers. We got to change the framework and the narrative about how we talk about teaching. We also absolutely need to support our early teachers much more than we do. We support, if you get lucky in a district, you get 1 year of support from a mentor. We've got to be supporting teachers into their third year at least, and that's something I'm absolutely going to advocate for. My husband is working on his national board certificate right now, so we are walking through that process as a family. It is a very intense process. More school districts need to invest in providing stipends and scholarships for that. It's an incredibly expensive process. If you're an early teacher, you're probably still paying your your student loans back on top of then having to pay for that. So we have to think about things like eliminating ProCert and just having national board certified, the certification process. because it's very expensive. We have to do a better job. If we say we want high qualified teachers, we need to be willing to invest in that. And as a state, we haven't, most districts don't have a Bellevue that can invest in teachers doing that process, and we're asking teachers to do it on their own.
I think this is a part of basic education. You can't separate high-quality teaching and learning from the state's commitment to teachers themselves. So our approach for the better part of the last 10 or 15 years was to amp up the number of standardized tests that our teachers needed to get into their teacher prep program, to exit their program and methods, as well as content, early assessments when they get there, and then a pro-cert process. And oh, by the way, if you want to actually get paid more, you should also do a national board process and get a master's degree along the way. We're to the point where it is 7 formal or 8 formal processes for somebody to get into the profession and stay in the profession. Now, we need high accountability, no question about it. But if you take a look at countries like South Korea or Poland or Finland, you would find that the most competitive programs at the university level to get into is not law school, it is not medical school, it's not MBA programs, it's teacher prep programs. They make the compensation packages within their country so competitive to the median that it is the viable pathway for students who really want to both give back and have a very successful financial life. We do not do that here. We put a market value on altruism. We say it's all about the medical school, the law school, and the business school, and teachers. A certain premium in your life should be how much you love kids. Loving kids does not feed families. As much as I love kids and I love teaching. So it is about intentionally recruiting. It is about absolute financial aid if we're serious about this. When we have a nursing shortage, we run through walls to solve it. When we have a teacher shortage, we go, maybe we'll figure that out. You have to recruit very intentionally. We have to recruit staff and teachers of color so that we begin to reflect our communities and our teachers. They need professional support along the way, and they need a simpler process to maintain their certification besides pro-cert. And there has to be financial incentive for them to be a part of that. That is the commitment we should make as part of a system committed to basic ed. And if we do that right, we'll begin to turn this around. But your teacher prep programs are down 25% from where they were 5 years ago in teacher grads. The market is speaking loudly. That timeout means I'm done.
Do I have time to ask that last question?
Actually, there's just 5 minutes left before we're supposed to wrap up. So we're going to invite our executive director up to thank you all and then give you a few minutes just to talk with people in the room, if that's okay.
And in closing, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Right, yeah.
Yes, before I said, yeah. Jeannie, since we have about 5 minutes, should we give them each about a minute to make a closing statement?
Yeah, if you would like to make a closing statement.
And we're back.
1 minute each. Please.
1 minute. Thanks again for having us. This is a tremendous room. I'm Chris Reykdal. I would love to earn your support. I believe the role is about education policy and education passion, but you have to bring the lens of finance and budget because you are the state CEO in charge of $9 billion, 400 employees, and a policy framework, a relationship with the legislature, and an understanding how to move critical policy and budget through that framework. Those are the skill sets that I bring. I've been endorsed by the last 3 superintendents in that role who all say it is really important that we have folks who know education, but man, when I got here, it was all about the politics of achieving an agenda through the legislature and actually building teams of success. And so I'm very grateful for their support. Democrats and Republicans across the state, it's been a tremendous run. We've worked very, very hard. We're thankful to have the chance to speak with you. And again, I'll hang around afterwards to answer any specific questions. Thank you so much.
So Erin Jones, and again, I've been a classroom teacher. I've been at the state as an administrator and then in a school district. And I really believe we have an obligation to the people to better represent a diverse array of voices. We have an obligation to make sure that as we make decisions, it makes sense in all spaces, whether it's here in Bellevue or Walla Walla or Omak or Bridgeport. And that's what I believe I'm committed to. We've got to have a clear vision, and I will invite whoever's interested, should I be elected, to be part of the voices at the table to make sure we craft a very clear vision. I'm a basketball player. I want to see where the hoop is. You know, those of you who are paying, you're paying tax dollars, you want to see where is that money going to. And so I think we need to have a really clear vision. And then I believe it's our responsibility to be visible, not just in Olympia. That is a part of the work, but to be visible across the state so you know who we are, you know that we care. And thanks so much for investing in your young people and for giving us this space today.
Okay, on that note, I'd just like to thank both of you for coming and doing your 778th forum, or whatever that number is. Learned so much, very inspiring, both of you. And for everyone in the audience, thank you for coming today to make this a success. This is just one of the things that our partnership, Bellevue Schools Foundation, PTSA, do to help educate the community, and it's all possible because of you. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy speaking with the candidates a little bit more.